We are about to start the last session of today's conference. And let me introduce myself. I'm Guido Saracco. I am the chairman for the last session. I am the rector of the Politecnico di Torino. That was the first Italian technical university, founded in 1859. A glorious time because we were ahead of MIT at that time, because MIT was not funded yet. I've been a researcher, let's call it a scientist, also in the area of technologies for sustainable future, and before becoming a rector in 2018, I was leading the Italian Institute of Technology Center in Turin. That was on technologies for sustainable future, and it was the site of the Italian Institute of Technology where this kind of research was taking place under the guidance of Roberto Cingolani, that was the general scientific director of the IIT, and now is the Ministry of the ecological transition, we call it in Italy. Now, the final session of today is about governance of climate change, so taking decision to drive. This is lessons for politicians, I would say, to take the right decisions, and they are based on economical considerations. There is no doubt that the 2015 Paris Agreement were driven by the fact it was clearly understood of the effect on economics of climate change. So there is no surprise that two of the speakers, excellent speakers of today, are economists. And to take the right decision, you need also to have the right measures of regional, local, also global trends. And so the last speaker today is Bruno Carly about new kinds of measures from the space. So let me introduce the first speaker that is going to talk from remote. It's Professor Gernot Wagner from New York University, and the title of his speech is Pricing Climate Risk and Uncertainty. Please, Gernot, are you there? Yes, I see you. Please try talk because I cannot hear your voice.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, yeah, that's
Hi
it.
from New York. Okay.
Please. The stage is yours.
Terrific. Thank you, and thank you for the possibility to join remotely. Let me start with sort of 2 points, and sort of the 2 main points I would like to hammer home over and over again, and then of course backtrack from there and try to add more nuance. So one is, as an economist, full disclosure, that's that's who I am, and that's in many ways the one discipline, the one social science discipline that, for better or worse, has had undue influence on the broader debate here. But to an economist, and not to be too eclectic here, or all encompassing, but the one number that comes up over and over again when one talks about climate change on the one hand, climate policy on the other, i.e., how much does unmitigated climate change cost on the one hand, and of course, how much should every ton of CO2 emissions cost on the other? And yes, broad philosophical questions. But the one number is the social cost of carbon, which comes with various definitions, which has lots and lots of problems on its own. Lots of assumptions that feed into this calculation. But for better or worse, it is this one number that you might describe as the holy grail of climate economics, climate policy, or whatever all-encompassing term one might use for it, that if it didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. Okay, what is that? What is this social cost of carbon? It is the measure of what each ton of CO2 emitted today should cost, does cost on the one hand, and of course should cost from a policy perspective, from some sort of sense of there is this optimum number out there. That term itself is very loaded, of course, that would allow us to say, if we were to price CO2 at that level, we would internalize the negative carbon externality, to use the technical economic term, and we would solve it all. And of course, as soon as I say this, right, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of caveats. So one is this loaded term should. And that's a 90-minute philosophical conversation. Another one is what does internalizing the externality mean, right? So you are talking about cost of carbon. You are an economist, so you must mean carbon tax, cap and trade system, a price. Well, sort of, kind of, maybe, sometimes, but no, not really. It's not just that, and it's not even not just that, but frankly, the sort of policies that we all know are necessary go well beyond the sort of classic statement of economics 101, where you would say price CO2, get out of the way, and everything else will fall into place. So, for example, what might be described as the first climate policy ever instituted, by the way, had nothing to do with climate change at the time, but it happened to have happened in the year 1207. King Edward I, England, he banned the burning of coal, of sea coal. Why? Because his mom had asthma. At least that's what we think happened. His mom was sick, right? The mother of the King of England was sick. There was a lot of soot in town, in Nottingham. In this case, that's where his mom lived, but of course, London and the entire, right, his in his empire. So one drastic measure, if you will, was banning the burning of sea coal. The penalty for burning coal: death for repeat offenders. Opinions differ whether this penalty was ever enforced and whether the death penalty was truly the penalty even on the books. There are rival historians fighting over what is correct here. But for dramatic effect, let's just say it was the death penalty. It remained in place for about a decade before it was vacated, was turned into a tax. Then there came a commission, and of course, one industrial revolution later, we are still burning coal. But actually, when you look at England itself, right, it started with very few people in the coal sector. Of course, it started with 0. In 1920, there were 2 million people in Great Britain, the UK, employed in the coal sector. 2 million Brits employed in the coal sector. Right now, it's around 2,000. There are 2 remaining coal plants. None of them are operating as of this morning, and they'll both be mothballed, shut for good within the next few years by law. Okay, is that climate policy? Well, the 1207 one, of course, wasn't. It was air pollution policy, if you will. But now, shutting down coal plants, yes, of course, that's climate policy, energy policy. What's the equivalent price per ton of CO2? Well, we started with infinity, right? Technically, when there's a death penalty on burning a lump of coal, then the implied price per ton of CO2 or ton of coal is infinitely high. It doesn't get any higher than death penalty. Is that the right price? Well, in some sense, for coal in the UK, starting a couple years from now, we will be back to an infinitely high price. because coal does not exist, right? Will not exist, will not be burned. That's climate policy. It's climate policy for lots and lots of other reasons, right? Margaret Thatcher in the 80s trying to squash the coal union and so on and so forth. Lots and lots and lots of other reasons. Is it an appropriate price? Well, opinions differ widely. From a strict economic perspective, you would have to say that an infinitely high price is, infinitely too much relative to what the cost effective, efficient, or whatever else price ought to be, could be, should be. From a sectoral policy approach, is it appropriate to simply ban certain fuels or certain technologies, incandescent light bulbs, for example? Right? Well, yes, up to a point, that might be the appropriate policy. There are good, pure economic reasons to believe why we should not be using internal combustion engines too, but incandescent light bulbs in this example, and therefore they should simply be banned. How does that compare to the social cost of carbon? Well, it's infinitely more than any social cost of carbon calculation would lead us to believe ought to be applied, but are sectoral policies guided by a vision of certain technologies simply ought not be used? Are these policies appropriate? Yes, they might be. The EU, the US, George W. Bush here in the US signed the law in place that effectively banned the use of incandescent light bulbs. Cue the sort of opposite end of the political spectrum, introducing the Light Bulb Freedoms Act to try to reverse that decision. Well, that failed at the time. But that's climate policy. The price is infinitely high because you are not allowed to use incandescent light bulbs in this case. Is it an appropriate policy? I would say so. Yes, it is. There are better technologies. There are lots and lots of factors standing in the way of adopting those technologies. So having a standard, an efficiency standard here that effectively bans a particular product might be appropriate, is appropriate in this context. Very different, of course, from the typical economist's pronouncement of saying, set a price and get out of the way, unless we believe the price ought to be infinitely high. Okay, so what does that leave us with? It leaves us with this guidance coming from global social cost of carbon calculations that I would say set the bare minimum price standard intervention to what we ought to be doing. And when I say bare minimum, there is another consideration here, and that is uncertainty, risk, unknowns, unknowables, unquantifiables, whatever your term. It's the sort of thing that we think we know happens. Sometimes we do know happens, but simply does not get incorporated, internalized, typically in the standard calculation that emphasizes the mean, the median, the average, the most likely. Right? In some sense, by definition, these tail events, low probability, high impact events, tipping points, lots and lots of names, often very confused in how they get used and what does in fact count as a tipping point, a fat tail event, a heavy tailed event, and so on and so forth. But when you put those together, try to analyze them, the one thing that becomes clear over and over and over again is that the sort of calculations that we economists, climate policy wonks attempt to do to try to calculate what the social cost of carbon, what the price per ton of CO2, explicit or implicit, ought to be, is more often than not an underestimate of the true cost. lots of examples to mention why that might be the case, but the sort of the technical look at this is essentially a probability density function, a PDF, not the thing that Adobe gives us, but at the statistical sense, a bell curve, a distribution that has a left tail that can be cut off fairly quickly, largely because adding CO2 is not going to decrease global average temperatures, right? We can cut things off on the left-hand side. And of course, by now we know that adding CO2 in fact has increased global average temperatures by quite a bit already. So we can cut things off to the right of the zero axis. On the right-hand side, on the tail, we are not that lucky. And there too, of course, informed opinions differ widely where we can cut things off, how important those tail events might be, how crucial it is to emphasize the tail, to look at these low probability, high impact events, and so on and so forth. And every IPCC report will, tells us slightly more once again about where we can cut off those tails. But the big but in all of this is if there are biases, since there are biases in these calculations, the vast majority, if not all of them, skew things into one and only one direction. And here's sort of the point where I need to add a bit of a finer point toward what I said about social cost of carbon before. That the exact definition of the social cost of carbon in fact matters. It matters a lot. From a US perspective, where I sit, the social cost of carbon often gets defined simply as, and simply in quotation marks, as the cost of each ton of CO2 over its lifetime discounted back to the present, right? So what does each ton of CO2 emitted today cost over its lifetime? 40% of the stuff sticks up there for at least a millennium and so on. So it's a long-term problem, a global problem, irreversibilities, lots of uncertainties and risks. They all figure into this, but the focus is on the costs. Or in other words, the number that comes out of this calculation, the US social cost of carbon, formally calculated by the administration, is an input into benefit cost analyses because it only focuses on the costs. Then there are calculations that climate economists often do that in fact try to balance the benefits and the costs, come up with what's often called an optimum price, and no, that's a loaded term and should never be used in polite company. But that too often goes under the heading of social cost of carbon. Both of these calculations have biases, in part for the same reasons, but there is also this additional factor, right? If what you're doing is balancing the benefits with the costs, and benefits in this case is cutting CO2 emissions, right? That's the benefit. With the costs of doing so, you have biases going two ways. Which way do they go? Well, on the benefit side, the cost or the climate damages, which is a cost translated into benefits of cutting emissions, the biases go toward underestimating the benefits of cutting CO2 emissions. Why? Because of the unknowns, the uncertainties, the tail risks, and so on and so forth. So there's things we simply haven't gotten around to quantifying yet. We know they're a factor. We haven't yet quantified them. So the biases there are toward a lower social cost of carbon. The biases on the cost side, and when I say cost now, I mean the cost of cutting CO2 emissions, are often on the high side. Why is that? Because of technological progress. Right? Solar photovoltaic, famously, 10 years ago, 10 times as expensive as today. 40 years ago, when Jimmy Carter put the solar panels on the White House, 100 times as expensive as today, right? Minus 99%, minus 90% within 40 years, 10 years, respectively. Huge advances, amazing advances on how we climbed the learning curve, slid down the cost curve, and solar, photovoltaic, renewables writ large are much, much cheaper today than anyone imagined, 10 years ago, 40 years ago. Sort of keeps surprising us. The International Energy Agency sort of keeps being surprised by how quickly these technologies decrease in price. Well, those surprises, much like the uncertainties on the climate cost front, on the climate damage side of things, bias this calculation, and they bias them again in the exact same direction of too little action on climate change as opposed to too much, if there is such a thing. Okay, so that's the social cost of carbon definition where we balance benefits with costs. What about strictly the US version where you only focus on the benefit side, on the cost of unmitigated climate change? Well, the technology aspect doesn't matter in this case. That's outside the analysis. Now we are squarely back with the tipping points, the fat tails, the tail events, the uncertainties, the unknown unknowns, in ex-Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld's words. All of these things bias the calculation towards a lower cost than an emphasis on these tail events, uncertainties would lead us to believe. So the upshot to me is that whenever you see one of these calculations, whenever the US social cost gets calculated and somebody says, oh, the mean, the median, the average, the most likely is $50 or $100, or in some sense, it really doesn't matter what that number is per ton of CO2, it will be biased downward, lower than it ought to be. And none of this even includes other considerations. So Parthadasgupta is joining this session, right? So he has spent a lifetime working on crucial topics of uncertainty, of discounting, how these topics interact, how uncertainty interacts with the discount rate, and what does that mean? Which way does the bias go now? And once again, I would say the bias, for the most part, not exclusively, for the most part, goes in one and only one direction. What is that? It is that this number that comes out of the calculation at first is a lower bound, a lowercase conservative number, a probable underestimate, or whatever the term. It is telling us what we ought to do on the policy front at bare minimum. It's not the target that we should be shooting for and then declare the problem solved. It's what we should be doing at bare minimum. So, right, for example, lots and lots and lots of policy conversations around this. Austria, not quite Italy now, but close enough. Current conversations, tax reform, the conservative government in a coalition with the Green Party, right? So both ends of the spectrum here, is currently talking about introducing a carbon price of 25 euros per ton of CO2. Much, much lower than the emissions trading system in Europe, much, much lower than many other policies that are already in place, should be put in place. Is that 25 euros per ton of CO2 the right number? No, it is not. 25, all else equal, fine, sure, maybe, okay. 25 as a replacement for other climate policies that in part are much, much stronger? No, definitely not. And of course, we have similar conversations here in the US and frankly, the world over, right? This is where the economists leave the room and the politicians enter. Is it appropriate to say 50 euros, $50 per ton of CO2 is the right price because the US social cost of carbon number currently does say $50? No, and no for two reasons. One, because of everything I just said, uncertainty and so on. And two, because in this case, we even have sort of a live example of who wants those $50. There's literally a coalition currently lobbying for $50 per ton of CO2, and everyone's favorite climate pariah is part of this coalition. So ExxonMobil wants $50 per ton of CO2. and you don't have to be an economist insisting on revealed preference and people's revealed preferences telling us everything you need to know in order to realize that, wait a second, if those most affected by a carbon price are advocating for a certain level, maybe that level is too low. Maybe what's good for Exxon isn't good for the planet for all the obvious reasons. And maybe there's more going on, right? In this case, what's going on is there is a trade being negotiated more or less that says carbon price, while preempting any and all other policies for stationary source pollutants, that would be stronger, that would have a higher implicit price. Ergo, probably not a trade worth taking. Uncertainty, lower bound estimate on the one hand, revealed preference, real world politics, realpolitik on the other. I realize there's a lot more to say. I won't. I have 30 seconds to go. But this is sort of the bare minimum of this sort of conversation that we ought to have, where we look at those numbers, realize that social cost of carbon calculations are important in and of themselves. They are, but there are biases. There are biases because of limits of the science, the climate economics, the empirical analysis, and of course, politics. And put together, they both, I would argue strongly, bias those results in one and only one direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As self-controlling speaker, I would say it's very good for me as a chairman. Thank you very much, Gernot. Are there questions from the audience here? Please. I think you have to speak English, because
my question is, in economics you see things in short, medium, and long terms, but when you speak about social costs, I think in ecologist way of population. If you see the way the population has gone in the time, you will see that there is big difference if you see these questions in short or long terms. So I suggest you, sorry if I permit myself to do that, to see this question, also in this kind of way, because if we don't, if the cost of carbon is too high, we have trouble to make cars, okay? But after 10 years, 20 years, social cost can be more and more hard, okay? For this low population, okay? That's the question.
Is it clear for you, the question?
I think so. Let me try to answer it two ways. So one is, and not to defer to the next speaker, Parthadasgupta, but there are in fact some deep philosophical questions here on long-term versus short-term. What is our business talking about future generations? What gives us the justification to do so in the first place, and what does that all mean, and so on and so forth? Should we be picking discount rates, right? Some omniscient social planner who decides, or should we be looking toward people's behavior? And yes, we have very long-term empirical results in limited, very, very limited applications, but it turns out through quirks in Singaporean and British English real estate law, you can either buy your property outright or you can lease it for 999 years. Well, if there is a difference in costs of that exact same property, whichever way you do it, right, lease for almost 1,000 years or buy outright, that tells us something about the discount rate 1,000 years out. or maybe it doesn't, right? And sort of these questions of short-term versus long-term are crucial. Thank you for the question. It is an important one. It is also, of course, very, very hard to get right in any sense of that term. And saying the term doing this correctly or the right way, of course, in itself comes with very with loaded implications. Okay, so I think that's one. Now, the second way to answer this is in very practical terms, right? If we agree that this social cost of carbon number, in whichever way it is calculated, is in fact a guide to how strong climate policy ought to be, choosing, picking, or calibrating the right discount rate is a crucial factor here. It is. How crucial? Well, in some sense, it's the defining factor. That's the parameter that matters. Nothing else matters quite as much. And frankly, I think that drawing that conclusion is an inappropriate one, saying the discount rate matters more than most other inputs. I would add a bit of a twist to this, and this comes partially from my own work on this, which is if one switches from the usual frame that climate economists have, and basically look at sort of our standard growth models, our standard analysis of climate economics, there's very good reasons why one might want to do this, this standard analysis. But if you leave that frame and move to a world that is more familiar to financial economists, to economists who worry about asset pricing, how is an asset appropriately priced given uncertainties and long-term trade-offs here. If you do this, and in some sense, if you go all the way, so CO2 in the atmosphere is now an asset, it's an asset with negative payoffs, again, but an asset nonetheless. If you do this, what happens? Well, if you turn this analysis to 100, and in one of my recent sort of analysis papers, we have, and many others have done similar analysis. What happens is the very path of how CO2 ought to be priced over time might even reverse. And what I mean by that in sort of broad terms, the typical pronouncement is we have a relatively low price. It might still be in the hundreds of dollars today, but it's sort of relatively low compared to where it will be in the future. You start low and you increase over time. That's sort of a standard result of climate economics. If you go all the way on this financial economics interpretation, and essentially an interpretation that says risk might dwarf all else, uncertainty might dwarf all else, this result might reverse. What does that mean? High price today, while things are risky and uncertain, decreases over time and decreases almost immediately. There's lots of factors that figure into this calculation. One of them is precisely this long-term versus short-term consideration. Doing things for today's population versus doing things for the future, for the as of yet unborn. Right? And that's a, let me just say maybe one sentence on this, right? That's a big difference in outcome. And it's highly, highly unclear which of the fundamental factors ought to dominate in what the right way to think about this is in the first place. If it's uncertainty dwarfing all, if it's future generations dwarfing all, and so on and so forth, you get to this world where, right, we need to do much, 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 much more on the mitigation front today than we currently are. And frankly, that initial push will push us over the edge, push us over the top, invoke a positive tipping point, socioeconomic changes almost immediately, and then we can ease off climate policy and live happily ever after. Is that the right answer? Maybe. If you go all the way in your assumptions, in your analysis, that's the answer that jumps out.
Thank you very much. There is still time for a short question. Maybe let me check whether there is someone from the Friends Connected.
Yes, I would like to read one question
yes,
here.
Please. Professor Muso is my co-chair.
The question comes from Nicolas Cassetta. I read it shortly. While in the Western countries coal plants are being closed, in Asia there are about 850 new coal plants in constructions right now or in the next few years. Thus, the Asian countries will have a great economical advantage on the West countries because their energy will cost much less than ours. Question, what would be the total cost for the Western countries for substituting cheap energy with very expensive ones?
So, great question. I would question the assumption behind the question, which of course is turning things around now here. But so yes, frankly, the number I've heard is not 850, but 600, but never mind, right? It's a lot of coal plants being built all over the world, outside the UK, which is mothballing its coal plants, outside Europe, outside the US, and so on and so forth. So how is this possible, right? What's happening here? And I guess, so there's sort of two ways to look at this. One is, right, rapid development, which in itself comes with positive, effects for welfare, well-being, and so on, right? Now, there are real trade-offs here, and that's the problem. Of course it is. There are massive lock-in effects here, right? Building the coal plant now will ensure, with not certainty, but will lead toward us being reliant on coal for decades out, right? We're not going to mothball this coal plant in 5 years if we're building it today, right? So lots of massive implications. What to do? Well, one way to look at this is, of course, from sort of this technology perspective that says, actually, if IEA, the International Energy Agency, declares solar photovoltaic the cheapest form of electricity in history, which it does, and it is correct to do, what are the economics here? Why are these coal plants being built? If it's actually not cheaper to do so relative to, right, IEA talking about solar photovoltaic here. Now, there's a big difference in scale. There's a big difference in scalability, and there's lots and lots of other factors figuring into this. But I would say an optimistic answer is to say, optimistic from the climate perspective, and for that matter, the perspective of costs to Western countries who are not building these coal plants, is that coal actually isn't the cheapest form of electricity. And it will become increasingly less competitive given that technological advances can only go one way up to a point, right? So that's one answer. The second answer is that, of course, it takes policy, right? Technology alone isn't going to do this. Just because there's this equivalence here in terms of cost, more or less, right? If you decide to build the next megawatt or gigawatt, solar PV may already be cheaper. The real question is, at what point does it pay to mothball, to stop currently operating coal plants and replace them with something else? And there, right, we have to have policy. We have to have that massive policy interventions that, frankly, China is a great example here of, yes, they are building many coal plants. On the other hand, they also own 72% of the global PV supply chain, 72% of global solar panels produced in China, right? Now, there'll need to be a flip here, a tipping point, if you will, on the socioeconomic front. But certainly the policy, the trend, in many ways goes in one and only one direction. Is it fast enough? No, clearly not.
Thank you very much, Gernot. Let's thank our speaker once more. And move to the next one, that is Professor Parthadasgupta from the University of Cambridge and a member of the Royal Society. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. We also see you.
Good.
So you are with us. Please, the stage is yours.
Can you give me a sense of how long I have?
It's about half an hour. And then questions.
Okay. I'll try and do that. I'll try and summarize some aspects of some parts of the review on the economics of biodiversity that I prepared for the UK government. It was submitted in early February, in time for COP15, I guess. So I think what I'll do is to give you something like a snapshot of not so much what the review says, but what the world is like at the moment and how we need to, we all, particularly the citizen of the world, needs to act in order to get communities, local government, national governments, and the United Nations agencies to take economics seriously. And by that I mean that our subject is, I realize this is an interdisciplinary discussion. Our subject, my own discipline, economics, is a profound one. It has been built by some of the finest minds of all time, and including people who have recently died, and they're giants. So the framework of thought that we have inherited is profound, the important, subtle, and wide-ranging. Unfortunately, we economists have actually misused it in a really significant way, and I can't go into this today because it's in a 600-page document, which is my review. And at my age, at elderly age, old age, if I were in India, I would be called a really old man. I feel it's appropriate, it's not inappropriate, put it that way, in saying that what I tried to do in this, possibly my last substantial work, is to reconstruct economics, to take nature seriously. We are embedded in nature, we humans. We have evolved in it. We are part of it. Nature is our home. And yet, economic models of growth and development and the economics of poverty, as it is currently received, takes nature to be outside it. In some sense, and I'm going to risk making a fool of myself in front of wise people like Ignacio, who know the history of thought much better than I do, that in some sense, the Enlightenment project itself has, over the past 400 or 500 years, encouraged us to think that the human person is a blank canvas on which you can paint anything you like. That is something that one needs to fight against, because we evolved with nature, and the rhythms of nature are something which we should take very seriously in terms of how we go about things. Okay, so in some sense, the great teachers of mine, the Arrows and the Solos, were not incorrect in the early 50s to construct models of economic possibilities in the future, by jettisoning nature and concentrating on produced capital, and very soon after, human capital, education, health. By produced capital, I mean what people very often call manufactured capital. I mean buildings and roads and ports and so forth and so on. Our growth models are really concerned with that, and they confine themselves there. Now, it wasn't a mistake because as an approximation. And the reason was the global economy. Now, I'm not now, I'll be speaking only about the global economy, all right? The global economy as a whole, aggregate, ignoring distribution for the moment, was relatively small relative to the biosphere. In 1950, global population was about 2.5 billion. Global GDP at 2011 prices, that's how I've done it, normalized everything in terms of 2011 prices, PPP was about $8.5 trillion. We were on the whole rather small beer relative to if you think of the biosphere as providing us with goods and services, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But over a 70-year period, from 1950 to 2019, let us say, before the COVID hit us, something really amazing happened. And this phenomenon has been observed by ecologists, earth scientists, and particularly earth scientists, because at the time I was preparing a paper with my daughter, Aisha, on demographic matters in 2017, we found an article in Science by a whole group of earth scientists who suggested that we ought to regard the Anthropocene as having begun in 1950. This is 70 years ago. And it corresponded with quite a lot of other evidence in the ecological sciences, and more recently in the economic sciences as well. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Something profound has happened. If you regard GDP as an index of human activity, and that's a reasonable thing to do, that's the first cut into it. And in case we are looking at growth changes, so even if you make an error, so long as the error is pretty much constant proportion, you're going to be getting the right direction. Take GDP to be the index of human engagement activity. And it's grown about 15 times from 1950 to 2019. To currently, of course, it's about $130 trillion PPP. Population has grown threefold, from 2.5 to, well, more than threefold to 7.8 billion. Of course, per capita income has also increased considerably. All these three time series, if you plot from 1750 to 2020, you will find very similar to the carbon story, that is to say, a hockey stick. And the turning point, the serious turning point we're looking at is 1950. So of course, this history, the recent history, the last 70 years history, has excited intellectuals in a big way. And every 2 years or so, or a year or so, you get this new book telling us we have never had it so good. So what are you complaining about, you environmental economists and ecologists? You know, we're living longer, we eat better, we're fatter, and so forth. So what's the beef? And why do people like Dasgupta worry so much about it? And he joins with the ecologists and writes papers with them and so forth, saying that we're in trouble. Because the problem is, of course, that our demands on nature has expanded in such a way that the demand exceeds nature's ability to meet those demands on a sustainable basis. So I want you to encourage you here to let your imagination soar and think of the biosphere as a renewable resource, okay? Like a fishery, for example. And of course, you can have technological progress there too, in the sense of altering the productivity, improving the productivity. For example, GM crops would be one. So I don't want you to think it's sort of that the carrying capacity is fixed. That's not it. That's not the idea. But nevertheless, it's finite. It's bounded. Okay. And we'll come back to that in question time as to what technological progress might do. And if your demand exceeds supply, then the stock declines. That's the imagery that I like you to carry. Now, what does this stock offer? Well, it offers a huge variety of services. And here, of course, I'm not saying anything that will be new to our ecologist colleagues here. I'm not talking only in terms of, sometime in 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is a profoundly important collaborative work on a par with IPCC. It was the first that really looked into the state of the biosphere, okay? Did a marvelous job in classifying nature's or the biosphere's goods and services into two types, two broad types, and I won't go into details here. One is the provisioning side, which provisioning services such as food, fibers, water, timber, you name it. Okay, that class of issues, the things that we demand on a daily basis. Then on the other side is a class of services which they call maintenance and regulating services, which are in some sense the bedrock of it all. these services will include, of course, carbon regulation, climate regulation that nature provides. The rhythms of the biosphere is how I put it earlier this afternoon. It includes decomposition of waste, cleansing of water, nitrogen fixation, the whole works, okay? Pollination, you name it. And there are many, many things to be added. So many things that are going on in the soils, for example, under our feet. So we're not looking at a single service, we're looking at a vector of services. And they're renewable. And of course, regenerative, the rhythms of the biosphere. They're operating at widely different scales, widely different speeds. Nevertheless, there's this amazing, to me, absolutely profound, almost brings you to sort of religious feeling, if you like, the synchronization of these beats, these rhythms. And that's where we are. And we have evolved with it. All right. But it helps to think, as we economists do, and putting weights on these services. So I'll be thinking of this incredible asset, the biosphere, as a lump producing goods and services in scalar manner. So I'll be talking about the demand we make and the supply. If you don't like it, think of it as a vector. Everything will be in a vector. You know, demand for this service, supply of this service. Demand for this service, supply of that service, and so forth. Now, one thing I realized from studying ecologists, and I should say I feel quite confident because the last 30 years I've spent an enormous amount of time. I've spent more time with ecologists and earth scientists than with economists for a very good reason. My research was going in that direction, and I really needed to understand this asset that I wanted to study in detail. One thing that comes out clear is that these regulating and maintenance services are complementary. It's not quite a house of cards, not in that sense. Complementary, it's an economist term, but the idea here is that they're not substitutes. Certainly they are independent of each other. So if you disturb one hugely, others come tumbling down as well, okay? It's not like a house of cards, not quite, but we humans have become so clever, so smart, and we think we are so smart, and we are in one direction we are, that we can turn that biosphere into a house of cards if we like, which is of course what we are doing with climate change, for example, bringing it tumbling down, and it'll bring a lot with it. Now, climate regulation is related to the subject of my review because it's on biodiversity, but of course, I'm not going to belabor the point. These are two highly integrated issues, one affects the other. And in some sense, the one complaint I would have, I would lodge against the received economics of climate change is that it has isolated the biosphere's services and plugged it into conventional models of growth and development, whereas we should have actually looked at the entire biosphere and brought it in and embedded the human economy in the biosphere. Now, I've tried to do that in a very orthodox fashion in my review. I have two star chapters in which I've tried to construct a model along very orthodox lines, and this was a deliberate move on my part to see how I could stick to orthodoxy and yet in terms of modeling, production, and so forth in a dynamic economy, and including the essentiality of the biosphere, the embeddedness of the human economy. Now, I won't discuss it here now. Okay, so that's the background. So I'll be thinking in terms of demand and supply. By demand and supply, I mean demand at a moment in time, let's say 2020, for the services that the biosphere offers, and the supply of the biosphere, okay? And keep the image of the fishery in mind. If you take more than its net reproduction rate, then the stock declines, okay? And then eventually, of course, the stock will be exhausted. So everything in the fishery model is there in essence, if you like. You can bring in non-linearities, uncertainties, and so forth and so on, no problem. But that's the image that might be of use to you here. What does the world look like now? by one very, very crude estimate. And by the way, all estimates here are crude for a very good reason. It hasn't been touched by economists. We haven't entered it. So as compared to, let's say, GDP estimates, what I'll be talking about now are far cruder, because prices don't exist for most of these things. So you have to simulate these prices, accounting prices, and so forth. Where are we in terms of demand and supply? By one estimate, as I was saying, the ratio of demand to supply is about 1.6, which is now used by journalists. They've picked it up and say that we need 1.6 Earths to satisfy our needs. Okay, so that makes it a dramatic way of putting it. And by the way, this issue isn't whether it's 1.6 or 1.7. That's not the point. It's more than one. And that's clear. And how far more than one is what you should be discussing. And this is not sustainable. This is extremely important to bear in mind, because they take the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, much lauded, much discussed, it's on the table. Yet, I have seen not a single paper before actually not my review, but this paper I wrote with my daughter 4 years ago now, 2017, in Population and Development Review. The first time I tried to estimate how long it would, whether the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the goals for 2030, are sustainable even if attained. Okay, it's all very well to say we got a goal, you get it there. Can we sustain it? It's a meaningful question, doable question, and the answer is very, very unlikely. So unlikely that nobody in his right mind would think it is. So we have to really work hard. Okay, so that's the inequality we're looking at. But I'm going to call it the impact inequality between the demand and the supply. Of course, you embed this inequality into a dynamic model. So those of you who are looking for a dynamic equation, well, it will be the stock of the biosphere in the imagination that we've got here now, regarding it as a fishery. The rate of change of the time derivative of the stock will be the difference between the demand and the supply. Okay, and the supply is the regenerative rate of the biosphere. And if the demand exceeds the supply, it's going to be the difference between the supply and the demand, supply minus the demand. So therefore, that'll be negative. Since it's negative, the stock is declining. Okay, how do you imbalance? How do you construct this is a story of where we are, and we are in a firefighting situation. 1.6 is not funny. All the evidence, including all the evidence from IPCC, never mind the ecological stories, is telling us we are really in a desperately bad situation. The economics of biodiversity that I reviewed tells us that the rate of extinction of species at the moment, in the last few years, is 100 to 1,000 times the background rate of 0.121 extinction per million a year. Okay, that's furious. Furious rate. We typically think in terms of species when reading newspapers and so forth of charismatic species for understandable reason. Obviously, those are the ones we see. They look cute. We just go to the zoo. There's a matter. But of course, for an ecologist, and at least for me, given where I am at the moment, thinking in terms of the review, the real problem, if you like, the sadness of what we have been doing to ourselves lies in the millions of species we can't even see. There are about 8 to 20 million species. We can't even count them. We don't know how many species there are. It's 8 to 20 million is what Peter Raven tells me. All right, that's a huge. And he says, maybe Partha, there are more. And we've logged about 2 million, if my memory serves me right. So we have a huge problem. It's, of course, the biosphere is also very heterogeneous. So heterogeneous that, the tundras are so different from the tropical rainforest and so forth. So we have a patchwork quilt of assets, if you like, which we have to deal with. The review places the entire problem of biodiversity as an asset management problem. Biodiversity is not an asset. It's a characteristic of ecosystems. So the unit of analysis in the review has been ecosystems, which are assets like a fishery, could be mangrove forests, could be coral reefs, could be anything, okay? Wetlands and so forth. And what I tried to do was to build this whole thing, analysis up as an asset management problem at the level of the individual, level of community, level of a nation, from the point of view of the firm, point of view of the global economy as a whole. Now, the essential problem, and I'm addressing not to economists, because what I'll be saying is the now, but perhaps not to my ecologist friends here. The essence of economics is to find an institutional mechanism, if you like, structure of institutions, such that the incentives individuals have to pursue their own goals, the private aspirations and so forth, given their resources at hand and the constraints they face, allow them to choose the best actions, which, when aggregated together, give rise to the common good. That, in my judgment, is what economics is about. So when people talk about shadow prices, accounting prices, they sound very technical notions, but that's what they are. Trying to guide our private decisions to be in consonance with the common good. And I want to use the word common good very particularly here at this occasion, because it's a term which has essentially disappeared from welfare economics. But when you're fighting fires, which is what I've been suggesting, we are in a situation of fighting fires, the common good is the thing. When your community is burning, you don't talk about heterogeneity of needs. You're all dying, okay? So you want to save yourselves. So this is the common good we are looking at. How do you measure? How do you talk about the common good in normal economic parlance? What should we be measuring? In some work I did with the late Karl-Johan Mailer, one of the great economists of our time, my generation certainly, died a couple of years ago. He and I produced a paper in 2020 where we showed analytically, as a very general statement, it's so general that it's inevitably very simple to prove, that no matter what your notion of social well-being is, the common good, let us say, there exists a measure built on the assets that an economy has. And by assets, I mean produced capital, human capital, natural capital. And I'll come back to other things like social capital later on in discussion, but just at the moment here for three. A notion of wealth, value of these assets, such that wealth and well-being are congruent with one another. If one goes up over time, the other goes up over time. If the one goes down over time, the other goes down with time. So wealth and well-being are not identical. They're not the same object, but they correlate. They work together. They work in harmony. Of course, the connection between the two is accounting prices, as economists would recognize immediately. Okay, it suggests now that we ought to be measuring the wealth of nations, which is what Adam Smith, after all, had asked us to do, not the GDP of nations, not the Human Development Index of nations. These are all ad hoc. They have nothing to do with human well-being, not in the sense that wealth does. So wealth measured correctly does the trick for us. And fortunately, this move is becoming more and more acceptable. Of course, there's a lot of applied problems arise in terms of measurement, but never mind. That has to happen. That has to be confronted. The UK is moving in that direction. New Zealand is moving in that direction. China, in large parts, is moving in that direction. So we're going to see that happening. We have to see the world, the economic development, as asset management, writ large. Okay. Now, having said that, if wealth consists of these three items, if you like, then it could be increasing while two of them are increasing, while even if the third is declining. That's for sure. And of course, that's been the presumption right through our development history. Because we say, well, all right, it's all very well for you to say that we're destroying this wetland. Yeah, but look at the factories we have built. Look at the shopping malls we have built. So that's compensating for it. And if you then say, what about wealth? They could say, yeah, okay, wealth is still increasing because, all right, so that's gone down, but these two have gone up too. And the point is, of course, those days are over. Aggregate. Those days are over because of the impact inequality I just now mentioned. So at the moment, the impact inequality is telling us that when we think of wealth movement, policies that are going to affect wealth, is the inclusive notion of wealth, then be sure that natural capital doesn't get damaged. It's that part which your eyes should be focused on now. This is something that Ken Arrow and I have written extensively on with Larry Goulder. We had a series of papers trying to estimate change movements in inclusive wealth. We chose 5 countries: India, China, Brazil, US, and Venezuela. And I'll leave you to guess as to why we chose these 5 and not more. We certainly didn't want to choose more because this was heavy duty work, empirical work. Okay, so, and all of them, we have some problems. Now, we'll come back. So we are now going to be concentrating on these.
Professor, we are about to finish the available time.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the recommendations of the review. That was the background, but without the background, it's not much point giving the recommendations. The 3 recommendations that come from this are: one is, of course, managing the imbalance, inequality, the impact inequality. And that requires attention at both per capita income as well as numbers. So population is something that we discussed at great length. The need for family planning in Africa, for example, that's extremely important, and reproductive health, that area. And of course, efficiency of transforming nature's goods and services into final goods, goes without saying, as well as improving the supply. So you need to cut the demand and expand the supply. All right. So that's the easier bit in terms of our understanding. I've already talked about changing the measurement of success. Economic success should be increasing wealth, whether it's wealth or wealth per capita, taking into account distribution, goes without saying. But the third and the final one, which I want to emphasize here, is the need for altering our international institutions, national institutions, community institutions in a big way. And I'll give you one example. And in a way, I want to end with the deep pessimism for both COP15 and COP26. So we have 2 classes of global public goods. One class consists of those which are open access. The open oceans is one, and the atmosphere is another. And there are many others, by the way. I mean, peatlands, for example, are global public goods. These are open access. Those 2 are open access. Then there's another class of global public goods, like the tropical rainforests and the peatlands are another, by the way, which are not open access because they fall within national jurisdiction. What are we going to do about them? In the case of the open access resources, well, sphere economics tells us we ought to have an international institution which monitors and regulates their use, e.g., charging for their use. We use them freely. All the goods and services that are being transported across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, and across the Indian Ocean, tons and tons and tons of stuff. Okay, this is oil and all these container ships. They're shipped free of charge. So why should we expect the oceans to survive? We're going to make overuse of them. The tragedy of the commons is looming large. And of course, similar thing with carbon in the atmosphere. All right. So that's one. Suppose we managed, just as the international community managed at the end of the Second World War to institute the World Bank, IMF, which were also concerned with supplying global public goods. They had the imagination to do that. Marshall Plan was another. We don't seem to have the imagination to think of creating an international institution. It's not on the cards. Crude calculations tell me you can raise trillions of dollars annually. All right. And what do you do with the money? It's easy to say, well, development purposes. But there's one other thing we can do. We can pay for the ecosystem services that the tropical rainforests and the peatlands offer the rest of us, the whole community. Brazil has the legal right to deforest the Amazon, and they've been doing it regularly, very systematically, converting into ranches and plantations. And they say we need it for development, and we need to eliminate poverty and so forth. You may or may not believe that's the only route, but the fact is they're going to get away with it. Question is, why don't we pay them for the protection and preservation? That will require negotiation. That's part of the deal. Goes without saying, everything has to be negotiated. And this entire fund could be financed from revenue raised at the international level. So this is one kind of institutional change that we could easily think about, but it's not on offer. And there are many others that the review suggests. But the point remains, and I conclude with that, our place in the biosphere is very precarious. We have basically violated the principles that guide the biosphere, the rhythms of the biosphere. We have been so brazen and self-confident that we've turned the use of the biosphere into a commons problem. And it'll take us a heck of a lot to get out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, are there questions from the audience? Yes, please. Introduce yourself before the question, please.
Hello, I'm Andrew Watson from the University of Exeter. Hello, Partha. It seems to me the arguments you make are, in a sense, you say that we have to, value this and we have to consider our wealth and the wealth globally. And in order to do that, one has to value the natural world and all these natural assets. Economists have done that and spent a lot of time doing it, but the real problem then is that there seems to be no agreement. We cannot persuade our populations, our leaders, what those values are. So how do we get this message across? Well, how first do we agree on those values, and how do we get that message across to populations and our leaders?
Thank you very much. That's a great question, and absolutely needs a response. So the way I presented the review is to think of the ideal, right? And then establish the pristine theorems, the way we ideally, a Platonic kind of ideal to go for. And then, of course, back off. So nobody is suggesting, even the United Nations is not suggesting, the statistical office there is not suggesting, even though they're moving towards wealth accounting, by the way, nor is the UK government suggesting that we have wealth measure in the sense that I was describing here as the pristine form, that you've got a valuation problem, you lick the valuation problem. What you do is, of course, to look at, itemize, you do an inventory of assets. That's the idea. And you want to see how the inventory is shaping up over time. If you want to discuss sustainable development, that's what you want to do. Now, that inventory could be a list of 1 million items. It could be a list of 100 items. It could be a list of 10 items, depending on how brazen you are in terms of using accounting prices, recognizing that many things are missing. So economists are used to doing that. Planners are used to doing that. Even the industrial sector, we break up into manufacturing, something else and something else and something else. Likewise here, you might want to break up the biosphere into various types of assets, as I was suggesting, wetlands and so forth. And at the end of the year, you might say, how much of wetlands have we got? And at what's the health status of the wetlands? That's the key. All right. Then the discussion then will become qualitative. Look, last year it was its ability over the last 10 years to clean water has really diminished. And it's been diminished so much that we might have to create a factory, a factory to be able to clean the water. Then, of course, attention goes up and says, well, how much is it going to cost that? And then somebody says, well, look, it might be a good idea to have a nature-based solution, like revive the wetland. That's the kind of dialogue we are talking about when I talk about asset management. Okay, I should have been clearer, but I had a limited time. But thank you very much for asking this. And I was delighted that you were now at Exeter. You've got a terrific, and arguably the best group of ecological economists and ecologists, this my kind of stuff in the whole of the continent.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Fafa.
Of course you would.
Thank you very much. Any quick question, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Thomas Stalker from the University of Bern in Switzerland. Thank you very much for your thoughts. I was wondering, how can these thoughts be brought into the education program of the next generation of economists in the classical economy department, which to me appear to be scarce of people like you?
On top of that, since this has to reach the politicians to take the right decision, so the chain is very long, I would say. You have only 1 minute to reply to this.
Well, I don't know how to reply that. I mean, I leave that to you to decide. But the education should start not just at the economic sector, by the way, it should start at the primary school level. We forget that so much of nature is silent and invisible. So you can't rely exclusively on institutions to manage it, because that requires verification of who did what and what the consequences are, or observation. And that may not be possible, and it typically isn't possible. So it's something where we need to re-educate ourselves to exercise internal checks and balances. We need to be our own judge and jury. And the review ends with a plea for a reform of our education system from primary school onwards, to essentially to urging us to become, all of us, naturalists in one form or the other. Because it is through understanding what goes on in a very complex system that we can develop a love for it. And a love for nature is something that we desperately need in an increasingly urbanized world. I don't know if that makes sense, but...
Yeah, thank you very much, and let's thank our speaker for the final time. We come into the last speaker of this evening is Dr. Bruno Carly, a member of the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei, and with a former experience in driving research in the CNR. The title of his presentation is Spaceborne Observations for Informed Choices.
A joke, an old joke, which is provide a pertinent introduction to what I'm going to say. Unfortunately, I know the joke in Italian, and probably one should never translate jokes in other languages. I hope that my translation does not miss the implication of the joke. The joke says, anybody can take a decision when everything is known. A good manager is needed to take a decision when something is unknown. A perfect manager is needed to take a decision when nothing is known. A summary of this joke is the less amusing statement that the difficulty of our choice are inversely proportional to the amount of information that we have available. And of course, we never want to need a perfect manager, and we know that with the unavoidable uncertainties that always are related to scientific research, we are always going to need some well-prepared managers to deal with the result of the information that is provided by science. Nevertheless, scientists would like very much to reach the point that anybody can take the right decision, collecting all the possible available information, and this is particularly pertinent in the case of climate change. What is needed is clearly a comprehensive information that tells us about all the processes that take place on our planet, and help in this direction is provided by the space-borne observation, because space-borne instrument can provide global measurements made with the same instrument, and then with coherent observation. In fact, if we look at what are the WMO essential climate variables, these are 54 climate variables that are now systematically observed to take under control the process that characterize climate. Of these 54 variables, two-thirds take advantage of the information that is obtained with space-borne information. And to this observation, an important contribution is provided by the Earth observation program of the European Space Agency. These slides summarize the activity that Europe is doing in this direction, and you see the wealth of satellites that are being developed as a function of time, the oldest in the background and the latest in the forward. And you see that there are 3 activities. This indeed concerns Earth observation, so these satellites address more problems than just climate, but many of these contribute to climate. And you see on the right the meteorology program that ESA does in collaboration with the EUMETSAT. In the middle, the Copernicus program that ESA does in collaboration with the European Union. And the Copernicus program includes satellite ensure continuous information. When a satellite reaches its end of life, there will always be another one taking its place. And then with a smaller population, on the left you see the science program, the program of the explorers, where a single mission are deployed to study, to address outstanding scientific problem that need to be explored, and also to develop technologies which may eventually become a new satellite of the Copernicus program. In this background of existing satellites, there are 2 forthcoming satellites that will deal with climate, and this will be the topic of my talk. The first satellite is the CO2 mission, which is one satellite of the Copernicus program, and the The second one is the Forum satellite, which is one of the Explorer program. These two are under preparation, and their deployment is planned for 2026. Starting from the first one, it's called Sentinel-7. The different satellites of the Copernicus program are called Sentinel and are numbered in sequence, and this is the 7-1. And its objective repeat what have been already existing measurements, which are planned now with in a more systematic manner. And the scientific goal is the understanding of the global carbon cycle with the identification and quantification of sources and sinks of greenhouse gases. But in particular, there is also the political goal of the quantification and monitoring of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission sources as an actionable information on the effectiveness of implemented measures and regulation. To observe the anthropogenic contribution to the CO2 emission is a difficult task, because although the main fluxes in CO are of natural source, and the net contribution is mainly due to anthropogenic contribution, the anthropogenic contribution is a small fraction of the natural sources. So to detect this contribution require very accurate measurements, and as was specified this morning, we know this amount with an accuracy of 10%, but we would like to know it better, and also at regional and national level, to transform this information into an actionable information that can be used for the improvement of the measure and the regulation that are implemented at political level. The instrument is a push broom instrument that looks at several pixels on the ground, and for each pixel, the near infrared, a shortwave infrared spectrum of the reflected radiance, the reflected solar radiance, is measured for the retrieval of the column density of CO2. But for an accurate determination of this quantity, there are also some auxiliary measurements. The first one is a multiple angle polarimeter that determines the distribution of aerosol and cirrus cloud. And the second one is a cloud imager, a sub-pixel resolution. And these measurements are important to correct for the bias that these two contamination of the observation can introduce in the observation. And then there are very visible measurements for the column of nitrogen dioxide as a tracer of sources that come from high temperature combustion. And this can be used to identify anthropogenic sources of emission that are often characterized by the simultaneous emission of nitrogen dioxide. The resolution and noise requirement are a resolution of 2 by 2 kilometers. This is the size of the single pixel, and this is very similar to the resolution of previous instrument, in particular NASA's OCO2 and the Chinese TANSAT, and is better of the two GOSAT mission that been deployed by JAXAs. And this a level of resolution that is needed to identify the single point sources, but a significant improvement, a significant investment is done in the reduction of the noise of the column density measurement, and these two plots show the difference that there is with the noise retrieval of 1 ppm in comparison to the noise retrievals of 0.5 ppm. The second allows a much better identification of the identification of plumes from power station. It may be surprising that this very low sensitivity of 0.5 ppm is very small when compared with the average 400 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere. That such sensitivity is needed to detect a plume which has a very high CO2 concentration, but we must take into consideration that the space observation observed the column, and the high concentration of the plume contribute to a small fraction of the column that we are observing. Then the frequency of the measurement, we need a global coverage every 2 or 3 days, and the single instrument is not capable of doing that. Therefore, presently, a constellation of at least 2 satellites and possibly 3 is going to be deployed. Then, in perspective, the design of the Sentinel-5 with this feature of small pixel size, low noise, simultaneous complementary observation for the reduction of systematic errors, and the constellation from frequent global coverage promise a step forward in our capability of independent assessment of anthropogenic emission. This could be a measurement that can be used to verify the national statement that are done about the emissions. And the improvement that the instrument will provide in the direction of global characterization of CO2 fluxes will be an important contribution for addressing the other outstanding problem that in carbon size that have been reported this morning, such as the contribution of fluxes from land use change, forestry, and geological emission and ocean sinks. Then, concerning the other instrument has a different feature. The forum is the acronym for Far Infrared Outgoing Radiation Understanding and Monitoring. And this is not a monitoring instrument, it's an exploratory mission that will last 5 years, and it will fill an observation gap and will improve our understanding of forcing and feedback. When we talk about the outgoing radiation, we talk about the cooling component of the Earth radiation budget. We know that the Earth warms itself through absorption of solar radiation, which is partially absorbed and partially reflected, and then cools itself by black body emission in another spectral region in the infrared. So when we look at the outgoing radiation, we look at how does our planet cool itself. And there is an interesting plot taken from a book of 2003. This is actually a an astrophysics book that it was revising our knowledge of the planet of our solar system, and in plotting the outgoing radiation from the different planets, it turns out that the planet of which the outgoing radiation was less known was our own planet, because at that time there were only scarce measurements. They only covered the spectral region from 400 to 1600 were numbers taken in the 70s. There was a mission that lasted a short time from 70 to 71, and then a further few measurements from another mission from 77 to 79 in a limited spectral region of the outgoing radiation. So if we look at what we measure and what we know about the outgoing radiation, we can say that now we have very good knowledge of what is the integral of the cooling component, because this is a quantity that has been measured continuously since 1975 by a series of different instruments. But if we want to know the spectral variability of this emission, we have measurement only starting from 2002, which cover the medium infrared spectral region. Also in this case, we have more than one instrument, and the measurement available are of very high quality. And at this point, we can say that it was this high quality that limited our observation capability, because the very good measurements that have been obtained in this spectral region, thanks to the photoconductive detectors that are here available, allowed to estimate with reasonable accuracy what happens in the spectral region that we are not observing. So what happens below 640 Webb numbers is still what we have measured in the 70s, and no other measurement has been made since. And this spectral region is important because if we look at sensitivity test, this is, for instance, a study by Wang et al. Of 2010, where an estimate of the sensitivity of the outgoing spectrum are made for a CO2 doubling, for the doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the first plot showed the change in the spectrum due to the forcing, direct force effect, due to the forcing of CO2. And then the others, the scale of the other is slightly amplified relative to the first. And then the others show the feedbacks to this change in, due to the forcing, and the feedback are due to change in surface temperature, change in tropospheric temperature, stratospheric humidity, tropospheric humidity, and high cloud formation. And the blue line provide the volume of forcing and feedbacks. The red curve provides the uncertainty with which that estimate is made. And we see that an important component of the feedback for many of these effects occurs in the far infrared. And in particular, the largest uncertainties are in this spectral region because the forcing is estimated from other observation and is not determined from existing information. And uncertainties in forcing is an important component of the uncertainties that characterize our model. This is a summary of the main of the value of the feedback strength that is used by different models in the case of water vapor, cloud, albedo, and temperature rate lapse. And then the last shows the variability of the different models for the integral effect. And you see that these estimates are significantly different in the different models because not enough information is available, because forcing manifest themselves at a small value at present, and even if with time are going to have an increase in contribution. And we see this when we look at how climate models match historical temperature record. We see that the spread of models that is here shown by the shaded area is very small for the historical record. Then when we go to a future climate projection, we have, of course, a large variability that is caused by the different scenarios, but also within a single scenario, the average is shown by the continuous curve, and the uncertainty is given by the shaded area, and there is an increasing amplitude of the uncertainty of our projection due to the uncertainties that are present in our model in many components, and the most important of these are the feedback. And this feedback, this uncertainty has a large economical value. There are many studies, and one of these by Cook et al. In 2013 estimated that reducing by 50% the uncertainty of climate projection has an economic value that ranges between 5,000 and 20,000 billions euro at global level. We have learned today that, of course, these estimates are very difficult. Also, the range of the estimate tells how uncertain to make an estimate, how difficult it is to make an estimate in this case, but clearly improving our projection allows to make a better choice and a better and more efficient choice with a significant saving in expenses. About the instrument feature, the instrument is a Fourier transform spectrometer and uses pyroelectric detectors. Pyroelectric detectors are very efficient, but they don't go very well with fast Fourier transform spectroscopy because they're very slow. And some significant effort was taken to combine a pyroelectric detector with the Fourier transform spectroscopy. The pictures show a prototype that was built in the early 2000 and was flown in 2005 on a balloon flight that reached 34 kilometers altitude, and measured for the first time the full outgoing radiation in a broad spectral range from 100 to 1400 wave number at a high spectral resolution. And this is the spectral, the first measurement in a so large spectral interval that is done spectrally resolved. And when we compare this, the observed quantity with the black body emission of the surface that is shown here by the green curve, we obtain the greenhouse effect, that is which fraction of the cooling has been subtracted by the greenhouse gases. Being the greenhouse effect a very important component of climate change, I think that any textbooks on climate should show this picture. and I don't see much of this picture around. Then the measurement requirements of Forum is a spectral coverage that better match the full spectral range of the outgoing radiation from 100 to 1600 wave number. And then it has an absolute radiometric accuracy at 3 sigma of 0.1 Kelvin. That means an accuracy of 30 millikelvin at a level of 1 sigma. And it is, of course, a challenging requirement, but is very important because even if this number may seem very small, we need to know feedback effects at this level, because these feedback effects, when integrated globally and over a long time interval, are going to cause important change in the future state of our atmosphere. Then measuring this new spectral region, it will also provide other very interesting measurement, because this plot shows the complex refractive index of water and ice. Water is the line in red, and ice is the line in blue. And you see that there are different optical properties which translate in different behavior in terms of scattering and absorption and emission. So this variability is particularly important in the spectral interval that so far has not been measured, and observation of the cirrus cloud component in this new spectral interval will be very important to understand the ice-water composition of cirrus clouds. Another important effect that is occurring again at low temperature, cirrus clouds are very low temperature, but also snow is a low temperature. And when we talk about low temperature emission, we talk about emission that falls mainly at long wavelength, that occurs therefore mainly in the far infrared and cannot be observed as well in the middle infrared. Another important effect is that recently it has been determined that the emissivity of snow depends on the type of snow, and there may be a significantly different emissivity that can be confused in temperature difference in our observation. And determining the emissivity of snow is quite important to determine the temperature of polar regions. And measurements in the far infrared will be able to reduce our certainty on this quantity. So summarizing what will be done with the Forum instrument, the spectrally resolved measurements of the cooling component of the Earth radiation budget can improve our understanding of forcing and feedbacks and reduce the uncertainties of model projection. Then the unprecedented radiometric accuracy of Forum will provide a fundamental benchmark of global radiance that occur at present time, which will be very important in future observation to tell how much and how the outgoing radiance has been changing over the years. Then, concluding, we are seeing that these two instruments have been driven mainly by scientific objectives, but at the same time, we observe that a more exhaustive scientific observation can also provide the instrumental information required by political action, and so can make easier the political choice. So observation are also important for the future political choices. And with this consideration, I thank you for the attention and conclude my talk.
Thank you very much. The last questions of the day. Please.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes.
Sicuramente. Mi chiamo Massimiliano Desideri, sono un libero ricercatore, va bene? Ho diverse domande. Yes, sorry. The first is, there is a measurement of how anthropic make hotter the atmosphere. Cioè, I mean, cioè quello che noi facciamo, cioè proprio effettivamente, cioè not the globally, okay? We see always globally the changing of temperature, but I don't see never a measurement of how exactly anthropically, cioè the fabric and so on, made of this temperature in the satellite stuff. Okay, that's one. The second one is, but I don't know if it's right for you, but I tell you. You speak about the unknown on the line, no? The unknown about the changing of the temperature, okay, and CO2. From many years, I see this diagram. Anytime I see this is linear. Cioè, they don't take care about the exponential acceleration made from feedbacks of nature that don't give a sum of the stuff, all these things, but make more than this. You understand me? Okay. Well, and I see that until now, we don't see reality for me, for my calculation, for how is my search, about it will be. Okay.
So about the question, we don't need satellite measurement to tell what is the direct contribution of us using energy. What you are saying, we use energy and dissipate heat in our environment. We know that this component is surprisingly very small. The direct heating of the world that we do by using energy is a small fraction of the heating that is caused by emission of the greenhouse gases. And this is due to the fact that our emission of heat is local and is done only once, while the greenhouse gases, once emitted, are there and last for a long time and will be there heating the planet for a long time. And at the end, this contribution becomes dominant. As the second question, I forgot it now. I see. How whether the model are linear or they take into account the non-linearity caused by feedbacks. Early models consider mainly the linear effects because are considered to be, of course, the most important component. And at the beginning is the linear effect that we are going to observe. With time, the consideration of feedbacks has become more and more important, but as I was telling, determining with accuracy the contribution of feedback is difficult, and we need to determine them with high accuracy because of their increasing effect as time passes. And if we want a good projection in many years, we need to know the amplitude of the feedback now with very high accuracy. This is a work in progress. These feedbacks are known better and better, but there is still some effort that is needed, and Forum is one of these investments that is made in this direction.
Thank you. 2 more minutes for questions, if any. Dear co-chairman, is there something from the net?
No, there are some comments concerning the Gernot Wagner presentation, but they are not questions but comments.
No.
So what I did is just to move these comments directly to Gernot, so he will take care. Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions for our last speakers, let's thank him once more. Thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to be one of the chairmen of this prestigious conference. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you too.